Over 60 years on, the assassination of John F. Kennedy remains the defining unsolved crime of the 20th century, and the evidence, as we will argue today, points nowhere near the conclusion of the Warren Commission reached in 1964. I'm Pelle Taylor. On today's episode of Capitals Uncovered, I'm joined by my co-host Martin Sieff and my German documentary friend Dirk Pohlmann. What follows is a conversation that the major media outlets have never quite been able to have. Here's why. Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. Dealey Plaza is lined with cameras, television professionals and private individuals alike, all there to film a presidential motorcade. Two of these cameramen, David Viegman and Jimmy Darnell, both work for NBC. Viegman is riding in one of the press cars behind Kennedy's limousine. As the motorcade turns into Elm Street, he sweeps the camera across the front steps of a brick building. The Texas School Book Depository. Seconds later, the shots ring out. The car is moving too slowly. Viegman jumps off and runs towards the murder scene. Some 30 seconds after Viegman's sweep, Darnell films the same building. So does Malcolm Crouch, a third cameraman on the scene. Researchers working outside official channels have since joined that footage together, and in doing so, they find something. In the shadows of the far corner of the depository's front entrance, a figure is standing, probably holding a glass bottle, an old-style Coke bottle, the sunlight catching it in a way that makes the hands appear clasped, as if in prayer. He's been called Prayer Man. The evidence suggests that this man is Lee Harvey Oswald. The official version, the conclusion of the Warren Commission in 1964, upheld without dissent by the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, ABC, CBS, Wikipedia, and every major school history textbook, is that Oswald was on the 6th floor of that same building, firing a bolt-action rifle at the president's car. But you cannot be on the 6th floor firing a rifle and simultaneously be standing 4 floors below watching the motorcade go by. This is not a matter of interpretation. It's not contested forensics or disputed acoustics. It's geometry. No secret document is needed to be found. No classified archive is needed to be broken open. The evidence is sitting here in plain sight, in footage whose original has been held for decades by NBC. This is what makes Prayer Man so dangerous to 60 years of official consensus. The man who did more than anyone to bring Prayer Man to public attention is not a professional historian, nor a forensic scientist, and not a Washington insider. He's Bart Camp, a private researcher who spent years assembling the photographic and film evidence, building a dedicated website and producing a documentary that walked ordinary viewers through footage that the major networks have been sitting on for so long. Bart Camp coined neither the term Prayer Man nor made the original discovery. That credit belongs to Sean Murphy, but it was Camp who systematized the research, identified the surrounding figures on the steps by name, and constructed the process of elimination that left only one candidate standing. Last year, I spoke to Bart Camp about his findings. Here's a short clip from that interview. Photograph taken by Darnell, who's an NBC cameraman. This is still of a video of a video. You didn't have video then, but film, a news clip, newsreel that NBC still hosts, and which now Congress is trying to get released. For some reason, unfathomable reason, NBC have declined to release this. So we've been frustratingly short of the full resolution required to see if it was Oswald or not. But if you look at the picture, you can actually see, although the face is blurred, it looks like Oswald. I mean, it's got his body shape, and it's got his hair shape and hairline. And it said I'll just get it summarized. So it looks like him. And we've got two written notes, one from Will Fritz, handwritten, and one from Hosty, another handwritten thing, which you discovered, saying the Fritz note said that he was out there with Shelley, and he wouldn't have. Shelley was his
in front, outside, in front with Bill Shelley. That's what he said.
And he wouldn't have known that. I mean, presumably, one counter argument would be, well, Oswald said that without. He was lying, right? So he could have been lying. So those notes on their own are not determinative, but combined with the fact that it looks like Oswald, although there's a blur in the face, those three bits of evidence.
Marina recognized him as well without prompting. Said Italy, just like when we shared some enlargement prints and we sent them
Right.
over, and we didn't even ask her, who do you think this is? She just went, yes, blah, blah, yes, it's Lee. That was it. Boom.
That tape and what it may contain brings us to Washington, because the push to force NBC's hand is no longer just coming from private researchers. It's reached Congress itself, and one of the legislators leading that effort agreed to speak to Fox News about what she's seen and what she believes the American public is being denied.
NBC actually has a video that's never been seen before. We're actually going to be sending a letter requesting that from NBC because it allegedly shows Oswald near the vehicle when the assassination took place, which means that he couldn't have been the shooter. So again, we're tracking down all this information. But look, there's even a CIA document that came out that Mr. Morley pointed out that actually said that the CIA never bought the lone gunman theory. And so I think the American people had an inclination as to what we were saying, but we never had the hard evidence until now. And so it's important to note that in a free and fair society, how could you operate or have an agency operating in the shadows? And so kudos to President Trump, also Director Radcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard for pushing for this transparency. It is going to be generational changing that they've done this. And we hope to bring forward legislation to ensure that this never happens again for future generations to come.
You're saying NBC has been keeping this tape of Oswald under wraps?
Correct. In fact, Director Stone actually told us that he was showed this tape, that it was a secondary copy, and that he said that this could blow open the entire JFK investigation. What I will also tell you, though, Jesse, is he said that NBC has been very, very much so guarding this tape. And so I believe that that tape belongs to the American people. We are going to be sending a letter asking for that tape. And I would encourage everyone to ask NBC to release that tape to the public. It's important, not just for our investigations, but so the American people know the truth as to what happened with John F. Kennedy.
Welcome to the Martin Sieff and Pelle Neroth Taylor show of Capitals Uncovered. We've got the brilliant and good friend Dirk Pohlmann with us, who knows just about everything about everyone. So we can, in other words, we don't have to carefully plan it around his areas of expertise. Because
Dirk laughs because he's modest. We laugh because it's true.
That's right. So what we're going to do, because I spent my week in my spare time researching, looking. I found an old manuscript, or I abandoned it late last year, which has dealt with the Nixon, Kennedy, and Trump. I abandoned it because Trump is in such bad. It's got such a bad name among people I respect. I didn't want to compare him to the others, but it was a period when I thought that Trump is under attack from the deep state, and I was drawing comparisons. I mean, Nixon and Kennedy are often seen as polar opposites. And of course, the two most famous events of the American post-war period are the assassination of Kennedy in 1963 and Watergate in 1972. A lot of people get both things wrong. A lot of people know that a lot of people get Kennedy wrong. But even the people who know that Kennedy was not assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, or at least not only by him, we'll get to that in a second, think, well, Watergate was triumph of good liberal journalism, blah, blah, blah. But and then evil Nixon. Well, he wasn't like that at all. I mean, it was a CIA takedown of him. Nixon had fired Helms, the CIA chief. 4 or 5 of the people in the Watergate burglars had worked for the CIA, and they'd infiltrated the White House, perhaps to sabotage anything that Nixon was trying to do. Nixon's not squeaky clean. Anyway, I put that. We're not going to talk about that today. And then Trump, we'll talk about that another time. The whole Russiagate thing, focusing on the fact that he'd the obstruction of justice. It's like someone hits you and you say, hang on, you're hitting me. Oh, he's trying to obstruct justice by saying he's innocent,
Exactly.
So it's all a bit like, and I thought that even then, and that's remarkably reminiscent of what happened when Nixon was insisting he was innocent, which, he was obstructing justice when he was saying he was innocent. Anyway, we're actually going to talk about Kennedy. I don't think we've actually devoted a special episode to Kennedy. And I was struck by how, on the surface, there's 2 famous books. There's a guy called Vincent Bugliosi and one called Gerald Posner, who are still the go-to books. One was published in 1903, one in 2007, 2008. And you read them on the surface, and they don't fail to use the word conspiracy theorists. They're rather arrogant, and they're very mainstream. If you believe that the Pulitzer Prize is going to the Washington Post and the New York Times are entirely deserved, and the world is a good place, and the fascists are our enemy, and the populists are Nazis, and the liberals elite, well, they want the best for everyone, then you'll love these books, because the word conspiracy theory drips off every page. But when you analyze some of those things, and I've gone into some deep dives, let's say this claim, for instance, that there were palm prints on the rifle that was found on the 6th floor. Well, it turns out there were no palm prints when you found it. It took 6 days for the palm prints to appear. And the FBI sent a team in to get the palm prints of Oswald's dead body. But I mean, what happens is the Bugliosi and the Posner books is that they refute the simple evidence, and then they are in turn refuted. But of course, they don't talk about those refutations. So it's like a first order refutation and doesn't deal with a very good scholarship that refutes what they've said. And the trouble is, I think, with a lot of Kennedy skeptics is that they're not their own best advocates. I mean, some of them are very sort of brainy. Some of them get things completely wrong. They focus on stuff I can't even comprehend, like did Oswald go to Mexico City? And they believe they're triplets and doubles of Oswald, and it gets very, very complicated, and they lose a lot of people there. But you can actually look at simple forensic evidence to show that Oswald wasn't, probably not on the 6th floor. And the most amazing thing is a guy called Bart Camp, a Dutch photographer. He's not the only one who's done this, but he's written a book that shows that Lee Harvey Oswald was probably standing on the doorsteps of the Texas School Book Depository, and there's a NBC footage of this guy doing that. That's Lee Harvey Oswald. Marina was actually shown this, and she said, "Yeah, that's Lee," and it looks like Lee even to my inexperienced eye. And before this video goes out, I'll place it in the front, so that people spend 15 seconds. You will have already seen this picture by the time you're listening to what I'm saying here. It's totally convincing to me. And NBC have actually rejected Anna Luna, who is the congresswoman who's in charge, beautiful, youngish woman, very much on board with this idea of draining the swamp. She requested from NBC, she's the chairwoman of the Congress's, fraudulent or deep state, whatever they call it, but it's basically tasked with finding out all the deep secrets of the deep state. She asked NBC, well, send us the original copy because it's going to be clearer and we can determine that it really is Oswald because there's a kind of blur around his face. They refused to do that. Why? I mean, what were they trying to hide? Anyway, that's enough of me talking. We're going to got Martin is an expert on Kennedy, and Dirk, you've just done a 15-part podcast, and we'll link to that at the bottom. Talking about many of these things. So you're fresh off this topic as well. Tell us about it. Tell us about if this echoes some of your findings and what your view is on all this.
Yeah, basically, I think it's the core event of the American history after World War II. It is when the United States lost its track, lost its innocence, and since then, for everybody who is an employee of the state, if you get a little bit into it, then you notice that things are completely off track. And then if you work in a state where you know that you have to lie to keep your career, and that people have to lie to get a career in the state, if for main politicians, for people in the FBI and the CIA and so on. So that poisons the well, so to speak. Yeah. And this is what really happens. You can see that for me, the John F. Kennedy is more and more fascinating the more I got to know about him. That was a breath of fresh air. I mean, I don't think that Eisenhower was a bad president. He had a bad CIA chief and a bad foreign minister, but he wasn't a bad guy. He was a very reasonable guy. But Kennedy is also, he's a young person, and there's so much possibility, so much hope for the future. And then this very good relation, which is with Khrushchev, where I'm absolutely astonished how that went, that they were heading, I got that from you, Pelle, yeah, that they were heading towards a world without nuclear weapons, where they would diminish the amount of military they had to just having enough to defend your own homeland. And it's basically the idea of Immanuel Kant for eternal peace that they were discussing. And then you could see there was a possibility, and they started to get along. And then if you read the final letter of Jacqueline O to Khrushchev, you notice that it was a, you could say, cordial atmosphere. Yeah, it was. So how much would have, they could have ended the Cold War? It could have been a competition between two systems. It could have been a completely different world. And this was ended in a kind of, I say, public traumatic event that traumatized the American society from there on. And we have to get back, and this has to be cleaned up, because if you don't clean up these kind of things, then in a way you're doomed. And I think this is also why these things are done, because it means power to people who work with these kinds of actions. But we all shouldn't, because that's not what our civilization is about as a promise. And it's also not practical. It doesn't work. We have to get to the bottom of the truth.
Martin, you've often been quite. We've talked about Kennedy in between shows, but I said I don't think we focused on Kennedy in particular. But what are your thoughts? I mean, why was Kennedy? I mean, Kennedy was trying to end the Vietnam War, and he was skeptical of Israeli nuclear weapons, and he was a civil rights guy, you know. So there were lots of reasons, and then he took on the oil mafia, as it were, and took on the real mafia. So just like Palme in Sweden, he was taking on many enemies simultaneously, and then you had this assassination. You're in America. Where do you see this story? Who killed him? And you've presumably followed this assassination for decades yourself. So what's your take on it generally?
Well, I have two enormous advantages over every European prognosticator on this and every younger American commentator. The first is 40 years ago, I started working at the Washington Times. And there were people I now realize who I worked with, who I talked with, in several cases who were friends of mine, a couple of cases close friends, who were very much in the deep state at the time and were at least on the outer fringes of the people who carried this out. That's the first point. We can name them by name. The second point is I have been to Dallas, and like you and like Dirk, I'm an old newsman. We are all old-fashioned enough to believe that you cannot solve problems simply by using online research tools, and certainly not with ludicrous AI. Whenever possible, you talk to eyewitnesses, you try and retrieve original documents. I'm talking to two eminent historians here. You both know that so well. And whenever you can, you go and visit the sites of the events themselves. I have been in Dallas. I have visited the Grassy Knoll. I used to be a rather, not a brilliant, but a respectable shot with a rifle. I couldn't hit anything at 6 inches now, but I was passable. I knew how to handle it. So I was able to assess the lines of fire. I've been up on the 11th floor of the Texas Book Depository, all of the above. But now let's solve the problem from the beginning, because it's much simpler even than you put it, Pelle. First, there was a double Oswald, and it's not an eye-bending woke piece of nonsense. It's been seriously researched, and it was evidence of deep state involvement. They sent Lee Harvey Oswald look-alike well in advance. Oswald had been set up as a patsy without realizing it. Oswald was not a communist, was not a Cuban, was not mad as that awful intellectual clown William Manchester, who I think won a Pulitzer Prize, of course. Like you said, Dirk, the lie is always rewarded, as it was in the Soviet Union. Stalin prizes for all of them. I'm a three-time Pulitzer nominee myself. But I will now suggest that the Pulitzer Prize should be renamed the Stalin Prize, because although many worthy people have gotten it, far too many whores and liars have gotten it too. But we know who is responsible for the killing directly, the mastermind. No question. Significant pause. Build up tension.
Yeah, what do you think? Allen Dulles?
Yes, exactly. All the way,
LBJ.
100%. No, LBJ was too much of a coward. LBJ was eagerly covering the whole thing up. So was J. Edgar Hoover, who knew Kennedy was going to fire him after he was safely reelected. Everybody knew this. Everybody knew this. But Allen Dulles was the man.
I'm sure you'll come back. What were the main findings in your 15-part series then?
That the files that had been opened are very interesting. They're very interesting in terms of James Jesus Angleton, where we know now. I think to not to go into details, but I think also that Martin is correct. There were these two people in the Mexican embassy, the U.S. embassy in Mexico, and it's quite important because. There was a sound file, a telephone, and so on. And that helps in a way to find out that there was something extremely fishy going on with Lee Harvey Oswald. It's not side scanning. But what is important is to see that if you look at what Kennedy tried to do, it's true that he tried to prevent Israel from becoming a nuclear weapon. And I think the idea is very much that he was also against France becoming a nuclear weapon state, which was in 1960. That was in 1960. So he was against that because that would make the world a lot more complicated. But what the point was that important to understand that Kennedy, the first thing that we need to understand is there was the Bay of Pigs disaster. And that was intentionally created by Alan Dulles to force Kennedy to go in a military confrontation with Cuba and maybe the Soviet Union. And they thought they could use this young man, 40 years old, something like that, to bring him into a situation where he would be, he had to go all in. And Kennedy didn't do it. He didn't do it. And so after that, Kennedy had a lot of the people like Thomas Power, so the SAC commander, then Curtis LeMay in the military, and he had James Jesus Angleton. All these people thought that he was too weak to be a president. He was not tough enough. And that is what happened. And then we have to understand that Angleton was the architect of the strategic alliance. And part of that was making Israel a nuclear weapon state. And that was of utmost importance to him, and he thought that Kennedy was an obstacle. And then we have files now that have been, one of them just by accident. It was a mistake that they unblacked Israel in that file. So we know from the files that this strange friendship between Angleton and Israel was of higher importance than we thought before. Just to give you an idea, in Jerusalem, we have 2 monuments for Angleton.
Really?
So in Israel, you have 2 monuments and one is next to the monument of Moshe Dayan. So Angleton had the same importance as Moshe Dayan for Israel. And why? Have you ever heard about the head of a counterintelligence operation of another state getting a monument? And he was so close. He was so close, and the closeness was the Israeli nuclear program. And this is because he considered Kennedy was not fit for his job. He was not on the strategic level thinking about how to get the Soviets to backroll them. And he was dealing with Khrushchev, what we just talked about. Yeah, it was a completely different attitude. You could compare it between Pelle and Reagan in a way, or between Willy Brandt and Reagan. So this is, I think, a thing that needs to be understood, and it's out of the files that we have now. This picture emerges.
Right. So you're aiming towards an Angleton Israeli project, if you like. Not that Israel was involved, but he was loyal to Israel, and Kennedy wasn't.
Definitely Alan Dulles, because Kennedy fired personally John F. Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, and it was like, Alan Dulles thought he was a person, he was a tricky guy. If we talk about Nixon as tricky Dicky, that's what you should call Alan Dulles. Yeah. It was, in a way, just to give you an idea there, Alan Dulles was in the Warren Commission that was set up. Alan Dulles was the man who, on the one hand, prepared the questions that the Warren Commission would ask the CIA about the murder, and also the man inside the CIA, because he was still there as a gray eminence, who provided the answers to his own questions. So that was all set up. And then you have the same with George Ioannidis. The same thing. George Ioannidis is allegedly the person who is handing, the liaison to the CIA. And he is asked if the CIA knew about Lee Harvey Oswald, and he says no. And he's lying because he's the person who was in charge of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
So in two times you have the fox
Sorry,
as
Martin,
the guard
yeah.
of the henhouse. Yeah. Okay.
What do you want to say, Martin?
A great deal. Because while I agree with Dirk on virtually everything, and I don't disagree with any of the specifics of what you said at all, Dirk, but I would say it fits into a much larger and completely different perspective. Kennedy, I had a colleague, and he was an outright racist, virtually a Nazi in the Washington Times, and he was also a brilliant man, and he was also brilliantly witty. His name was Sam Francis. He won the American Association of Newspaper Editors Awards for being the finest editorial writer in America 3 years running. He was the only member of the conservative Washington Times who was so good that even the mainstream media had to acknowledge him. They never acknowledged me. They never acknowledged the brilliant Bill Gertz. They never acknowledged my close friend and predecessor as chief foreign correspondent, the legendary Andrew Borick, but they did acknowledge Sam. And Sam Francis, who was a racist, but brilliant. I asked him on one occasion, Sam, who do you think killed President Kennedy? And Sam replied, well, Marty, there's no question. It was Lee Harvey Oswald up in the book depository. It was the CIA on the grassy knoll. It was Army intelligence shooting from below ground, and the Texas oil millionaires were funding the whole thing. And of course, the Teamsters, don't forget them. And then Sam delivered his punchline. It wasn't a conspiracy at all. It was a national consensus. Okay. Sam was making a tasteless, brilliant joke, but he was making a key point that President Kennedy had angered so many key, huge power sources, dwarfing the fucking Israelis, dwarfing them. And Kennedy was not hated and feared by the Israelis. They thought they could manage him and buy off the rest of the Democrats and defuse the nuclear issue. It was a concern for them, but it was not remotely a priority for them. What was a priority for them was what Kennedy had given them. Kennedy had given them what Eisenhower had refused to give them, offensive weapons which were essential to winning the Six-Day War. It was Kennedy who insisted, pressured Germany, and Adenauer was fully on the same page with him, but there was huge opposition in Germany from the old anti-Semitic right, and there's still enormously strong ex-Nazis who, as you have documented, Dirk, permeated the federal government at the time, and who Adenauer both had to deal with and coexist with, but who also, Adenauer, bless him, also fought them. There was huge opposition, but Kennedy overruled it all, and therefore what did Israel get? It got the Patton M60 tanks that were the key to winning the armored victories in the Sinai in the Six-Day War, and it got Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, which at the time were state-of-the-art, exactly, which Eisenhower had refused to give them. And the very first thing Lyndon Johnson said to a visiting delegation of respectable mainstream Jewish community leaders who came to visit him during the week of mourning for Kennedy, Johnson, who was a corrupt and wicked man, but also no fool and a brilliant politician and very sensitive to what people felt. He said, I know you are in tears. I know you have lost a great friend in President Kennedy. I want to tell you that you will find a better friend in me. Now, there were other stories to explore in that, and I think you, as well as I, we should do another show with you, Dirk, the two of us, just on that alone, how Johnson was bought by Jewish money as early as the 1930s, and bought by a lot of other money too. But the key point here with the Kennedy assassination is, who did it? Who was responsible? What were the motives? It was Allen Dulles. It was James Jesus Angleton. And but one other key point: why is the statue or tribute to Angleton placed in Jerusalem? Because the mayor of Jerusalem who placed it there was Mayor Teddy Kollek, who I interviewed personally several times, and he was mayor for 28 years. Before that, he ran Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's office with distinction for 15 years until 1963. He was a Ben-Gurion loyalist, but also he was the architect on the Israeli side of the special relationship with the CIA, and he was the key individual responsible for giving James Jesus Angleton the great Khrushchev the text of Khrushchev's secret speech exposing the crimes of Stalin back in 1955. He made James Jesus Angleton a star in the CIA. Angleton and Kollek were the two key figures in the Mossad CIA axis. And it was Kollek. That's why the tribute to Angleton is there. Angleton made Kollek a superstar in Israel, in Israeli power, just as Kollek did for Angleton on the other side. But Angleton, at the end of his life, he was or thought he was a devout Catholic, but he said some extraordinary things before he finally drank himself to death in the 1980s. And that was, I thought I was serving God, but I was serving Satan.
Okay.
But he was very specific. Who was he serving? Who did he think was God? And who did he come to realize was Satan? Alan Dulles.
What are your thoughts, Dirk?
No, it's always very interesting. So I'm not complaining about what Martin has to say, but there's there's one thing which is really valuable. I think that is what de Gaulle commented on. He got the full picture, and he talked to his media person and minister in his parliament, and that was astonishingly what de Gaulle said was never translated. The book was never translated. Alain Périfit, it was never translated to English, but David Talbot translated that part of what de Gaulle said, and de Gaulle said about. He got it completely, I would say. He said that Lee Harvey Oswald, the communist who was no communist, they took somebody and they built him up. And what we have now from the files is that we can see, for example, there was this 201 file, which was in the hands of James Jesus Angleton. So James Jesus Angleton personally was taking this huge file, and they built the person up. Lee Harvey Oswald went to the Soviet Union. He came back. That was a program that we know about now, where they had people as double agents. They were trained and they were sent over to the Soviet Union. He came back from Russia, and then he said, I was not content with the Soviet Union and I want to, and immediately he became an American citizen again. That is a good, and then he was sent to the Fair Play for Cuba committee, where he was, he was there, he was filmed, he was photographed when he went, handing out leaflets. It was like a theater play. And this is what, you don't forget that James Jesus Angleton, that his origin is literature. That is, he's a scientist for literature, and he was extremely good in creating this plot. And what we know now from the files that came out is this plot creation of Angleton and being on top of that. And Lee Harvey Oswald, who said, "I'm just a patsy," when he was taken by police. There are so many things. To give you a little bit, there's this forensic evidence, but there's a lot of other things. But forensic, for example, that Lee Harvey Oswald is he ran away after Kennedy was killed and was in a cinema. He was sitting in a cinema, and then he was behaving extremely strange in that cinema. He sat next to a person and looked at the person all the time, and the person was feeling uncomfortable. Then he went off. He went besides a woman and sat next to her and looked at her. And then he went to a third person. And what he did is he obviously, he was waiting for somebody to give him instructions. The point was that he was to be brought to a safe place. And then he was sitting in that cinema and waiting for the CIA person to get him out of this dire situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you're saying about this cinema, because I've been following the whole journey of Oswald very closely, and Sheriff Roger Craig said that the official story is that, cool as a cucumber, after shooting the President of the United States, he ran down 5 flights of stairs, then got a Coke out of a Coke machine and was sipping it when the building's manager and the policeman came in the other direction, and that's what's been immortalized in the Oliver Stone film. I think that's wrong. I think he was downstairs on the ground floor, and as said that the photograph that I have at the beginning of this podcast, I think has him standing in front of the building. at the very back, and this is what's called a prayer man, and there's a big meme now
Yes.
in Canadiana world. And if you read the very earliest reports, Canadian Free Press, the Dallas Morning News, the day after, before the fix was in, before the journalists had been told what to write, they're saying, as soon as we came in, we saw Oswald. So this second floor, first floor in British parlance, first floor coat room, lunchroom meeting didn't take place there. It took place on the ground floor just as they rushed in. In other words, he was just standing in the doorway, a meter away from where he was photographed in that NBC film. Anyway, after that, he ran down the slope to the six and was picked up by a station wagon. And Roger Craig saw this, and then we don't know I'm not quite sure what happened. Then he ended up in the cinema. He allegedly shot a policeman. But the point is, the official story is that having assassinated the president, he took a bus to his lodging house. I mean, as if an assassin would do that sort of thing, after this incredibly exciting thing. But the point is about Oswald is I think he was very much a man who was just by his actions lurking around, knowledgeable, and when he was taken in and say, "Oh, it's all going to come out now," he told the police when it was revealed that he'd taken off in a station wagon. The very fact that there was another guy picking him up in a station wagon, he was part of a plot. He left because he was part of a plot, but he was part of the CIA. I mean, as other reports have said, Oliver Stone said he was an anti-communist, he was not a pro-communist, but he was pretending to be a communist to create this image of himself, perhaps because he was being prepared by the great literateur Angleton to be a sort of sacrificial lamb or the patsy, as he said, so he was, and perhaps so that the Angleton could blame the Soviet Union and start World War III, or at the very least blame the Soviet Union and make people not want to go there because they didn't want to start World War III. But anyway, so he goes to he's picked up at the station wagon. He may or may not have shot a policeman called Tippett. I don't want to go into that necessarily. And then he ends up at the Texas Theater, as you said, waiting for someone. Take it from there. And what do you think happened next? And who was he looking for?
Yeah, he was the only assumption that makes sense if you behave that way, that you sit next, is that you're waiting, that there is an arrangement that if something goes wrong, and something went wrong. I don't think that Oswald was supposed to shoot the president, but he noticed that something was going wrong, so he went to this place and was waiting to be taken off, to be taken to a safe place. And then he noticed that something was very wrong because nothing happened of what had been prearranged, so to speak. So Oswald, and as you said, this is what de Gaulle said, the communist who was a communist and wasn't a communist. Oswald was set up to be this way. And we know, for example, what I mentioned when he was for the Fair Play of Cuba, for Cuba Committee. At the same day, he was talking to people who were in favor of Castro, and then he offered himself to train somebody shooting and as a soldier, basically, who was an extreme anti-Castro person. So he was always playing these two sides. And that's what he was probably trained for in this program for double agents that made him go to the Soviet Union.
So I want what I want is I want people to realize that these things go on, because then they become enfranchised, because they carry with them this arrogance from the Oswald did it in every application of what. Once they realize this, it's like a revelation. Once they realize that governments lie and the governments lied about this, and they did a careful construction of a lie, a theater, as you said, then they can go with this toolbox into any of the deep state operations we've seen ever since. And that's the one to go to, I think, because it's such an iconic one. Anyway.
No, absolutely correct. This is why I said it is you could say, the original sin of our age. That if something like this, you just imagine, like I said in the beginning, like you're working in a bureaucracy, you're part of a government, and you know that there's this big lie behind it. And then how do you proceed from there on? It will attract people who are good liars, the people who are, let's say, good Americans in the way you see them in Hollywood movies, who, it's always the scene where somebody knows the truth. And then on his last breath, he goes into the newspaper and puts the USB stick or the document on top of that. And the next thing you see is the printing press, and it comes out and the world is okay again. This is not the way it is. This is, and you need to understand, we have to make it that way if we want to live in states which are properly run. This is what we all heard in university about democracy, that it's a good repair. It is not the glorious dictatorship building, but it's good in repairing things. And that's much better. It's much better to have the good repair shop that knows about that things go wrong, and then you have to make sure that the people who lie, that they get punished for that, and the people who do good get promoted. That very simple as that. If you turn it the other way around, then what you get is probably what we have now. The decline of the West. So this is pouring acid on our foundations. And that's no matter if you're left wing, right wing, or whatever. This is a core thing that if you allow the lie to spread, then you're doomed. Yeah. And
you're right. I mean, and that's what I mean. The Washington Post. I was just looking at the number of people who worked in the CIA or in World War II intelligence in 1972. All of them were. I mean, Ben Bradley, this cool guy, I worshipped him when I watched that film because it was played by Jason Robards with his cool accent and his feet up on the table saying, "Listen, guys, we're going to get Catherine Graham's tits to the ringer for this, you know." And the truth is that they were part of the big lie, the media part of the big lie. So when we have this USB stick plugs into the computer and then the truth is told, we don't get that. We get another lie, and that's what people have to realize. But anyway, I think we got to wind up there. Dirk and Martin, if you just say, give us one or two, we're going to wind up now.
Sure.
Give us one or two books or sources where you'd go to somebody who's not up to speed on Kennedy like you are. Where would they go to start unraveling the truth? You, Martin, first.
James W. Douglas, Douglass, 2008 book, both in hardback and paperback in English, may have been translated, though I doubt it. JFK and the Unthinkable. That's the title. JFK and the Unthinkable. Back in 1975, an extraordinary book by the great Time magazine writer, lived another 50 years, but never wrote for Time magazine after publishing this, of course, again. And that is, They've Killed the President. That's the title. They've Killed the President. Not He Killed the President. They've Killed the President, by Robert Sam, S-A-M, Anson, A-N-S-O-N.
Right.
There's also an extraordinary book on the JFK autopsy called Best Evidence, which seems inconceivable and incredible. I'm not going to go into it now, but it's totally documented on how the very findings of the autopsy were controlled as well. But those are and finally, one book on Oswald back in 1978. He wrote others afterwards. Legend, by Edward J. Epstein, E-P-S-T-E-I-N.
Right.
Legend, by Edward
We'll
J.
put those in the bottom in the box in. And Dirk, what are your candidates for must read apart from your podcast show?
No, the one book that you have to read, and this is what Robert F. Kennedy said. It's on the cover of the book. That's James Douglas' book. As I said, The Kennedy and the Unspeakable. It's the best, I think. This is what you have to read. What you have to read to get it, to get the whole picture, and that it's worthwhile. I read it 2-3 times now. Yeah. And you can read it 3 or 4 years afterwards. And then there's another one which is not directly the Ghost, Morley, the new one on Angleton. That is also that's a must read. And the third one that I would mention is not exactly on the Kennedy murder, but really on Dulles. That is The Devil's Chessboard from David Talbot. That is a book that gives you also a good overview. It helps you to put the Kennedy story in perspective.
Okay,
I agree.
And check out, Amazon will have a lot of these books as Kindles, or you can buy them on eBay cheaply, or archive.org, I think, which is banned in Europe, but in the US you can get those books. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Great show again, and I hope to see you all soon. That's
Dirk, maybe next
Friday.
It's I love it. I always love it.